Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to reverently trace God's righteous judgment and His unyielding providence through the profound prophetic visions found in the book of Ezekiel. Now, if you're a student of the Word, you already know that Ezekiel is deeply moving. It's packed with striking imagery and absolutely weighty theological truths. So we're going to look really closely at a specific sequence of chapters that brings the devastating, tragic reality of sin into sharp focus. All right, let's dive right in. Here is our agenda for today. Instead of just a broad historical overview, we're going to take a deep spiritual journey directly through chapter 19, chapter 20, chapter 22, chapter 23, and chapter 24 to truly understand the heartbreaking weight of sin and the ultimate purification of God's covenant people.
We're starting off in chapter 19, titled The Divine Lament.
So, in the chapters leading up to this, God rigorously emphasized personal responsibility. But here, His divine judgment isn't just expressed as wrath. It's actually expressed as this profound, heartbreaking grief over the fall of Israel's leadership. It's a somber, poetic mourning over a people who've strayed so far from their Creator. To express this incredible grief, the text uses two really powerful metaphors: a lioness trapped in foreign pits, and a once fruitful vine scorched by the east wind. The lioness represents the royal house, raising up young lions, kings like Jehoahaz and Zedekiah, who became brutal and were ultimately captured by Egypt and Babylon. The vine, on the other hand, represents the nation of Israel itself, once planted by abundant waters but now completely dried up. These vivid images brilliantly illustrate the tragic, empty end of human pride when it rebels against God's plan.
And this brings us to a really devastating conclusion. As Ezekiel 19:14 solemnly declares, the fire of divine judgment has consumed the nation from within. No strong branches left on it, no scepter for a ruler. This is just a heartbreaking reminder of exactly what happens when leadership completely abandons their Creator. It wasn't just some external enemy that destroyed them, The fire actually spread from their own branches, from their own internal corruption and rebellion.
Moving right along to chapter 20, History of Rebellion.
Zooming out a bit, God explicitly reveals the generational roots of this spiritual decay. When the elders of Israel come to inquire of the Lord, God literally refuses to be consulted on their terms. Instead, He exposes a deeply entrenched history of rebellion against His creation and His holy decrees. This wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a deep, generational sickness. Across 4 distinct eras, God traces their unfaithfulness, from the idolatry in Egypt to the stubbornness of the first generation in the wilderness who profaned His Sabbaths, then to the second generation in the wilderness who just refused to learn from their parents' mistakes, and finally into the promised land of Canaan, where they immediately adopted the abominable practices of the surrounding nations. At every single stage, Israel consistently chose spiritual adultery over God's holy decrees.
Yet, amid all this dark history, we get a profound revelation of God's character. As Ezekiel 20:44 beautifully illustrates, God mercifully restrained complete destruction for the sake of His holy name. He didn't spare them because they were righteous, right? He spared them to uphold His own glory among the nations. So the absolute crucial takeaway here is that salvation rests entirely upon His faithful providence, not our own merit. God's zeal for His own name is literally the only reason a remnant survives.
Let's look now at chapter 22, the corrupted city.
Zooming back in from the broad sweep of history, this chapter serves almost like a terrifying spiritual diagnosis, outlining a terminal sickness that had structurally infected every single level of Jerusalem. We're looking at a city that has completely lost its way. To explain this, God uses the imagery of metallurgy. He describes the house of Israel as dross. Those are the worthless impurities left over when you refine silver or gold. God reveals His divine plan to gather them into Jerusalem like metal into a furnace. Because they are spiritually bankrupt, His providence must blow upon them with the fire of His wrath to melt away that spiritual corruption through fiery judgment.
And you have to understand, this dross wasn't limited to just one group of people. There was a total societal breakdown. The kings and princes were devouring lives like roaring lions. The priests were profaning holy things, completely failing to teach the difference between the clean and the unclean. The prophets were out there seeing false visions, claiming the Lord spoke when He absolutely had not. And the everyday citizens? They were oppressing the poor, the needy, and the foreigner. This compounding weight of sin shows a total collapse from the top down, where literally everyone abandoned the most basic biblical teachings of justice and holiness.
As the city's walls of morality crumbled under the immense weight of this depravity, the heavens paused. God looked down at this absolute ruin and asked one agonizing, piercing question of the people: will anyone stand in the gap?
Tragically, Ezekiel 22:30 records the heartbreaking reality. God says, "I looked for someone among them who would build up the wall and stand before me in the gap on behalf of the land so I would not have to destroy it, but I found no one, not a single intercessor. Not one righteous person to plead for the city the way Abraham pleaded for Sodom or Moses pleaded for Israel. The spiritual bankruptcy was absolute."
Now we arrive at chapter 23, the unfaithful sisters.
This total spiritual blindness is further diagnosed as God exposes their unfaithfulness through this tragic metaphor of two adulterous sisters. This chapter expands the imagery to show how both the northern and southern kingdoms actively sought out worldly alliances rather than trusting in God's plan. Comparing the paths of Aholah, representing Samaria in the north, and Aholibah, representing Jerusalem in the south, highlights a devastating spiritual truth. Aholah lusted after the military might of Assyria, and God handed her over to be destroyed by the very people she lusted after. But Aholibah, the younger sister, Jerusalem, she actually saw her sister's punishment. Yet, she completely failed to learn from it. Instead, she chose to trust in the secular power of Babylon, engaging in even worse spiritual adultery. She invited the world into her sanctuary, rather than resting in God's perfect protection.
Which brings us to our final chapter today, chapter 24, the boiling pot.
Because history's lessons were completely ignored, chapter 24 marks the point of no return. The time for warnings has passed. The Babylonian siege actually begins, bringing God's severe, purifying judgment to the city. God gives Ezekiel the intense parable of the boiling pot. Jerusalem is likened to a rusted boiling pot where the best cuts of meat are boiled. But the sin is so deeply ingrained, represented by the rust, that simply boiling the meat is no longer enough. God commands that the empty pot itself must be placed on the scorching coals. It has to be heated until the copper glows, to completely scorch away its filthy rust. The purification must be absolute.
And to embody the absolute severity of this judgment, Ezekiel is called to submit to a truly heartbreaking piece of God's plan. First, God commands him to surrender the delight of his eyes. Second, Ezekiel endures the sudden death of his beloved wife that very evening. Third, he's commanded to maintain absolute silence and refuse to mourn before the people. No tears, no funeral rites. Ezekiel's personal agony becomes a living, breathing prophecy to the nation.
Ezekiel 24:24 explains this agonizing prophetic calling. Ezekiel will be assigned to you, you will do just as he has done. Just as Ezekiel lost his delight, God is about to destroy his own beloved temple, the delight of Israel's eyes. And when it happens, the shock of the judgment will be so absolute, so paralyzing, that the people will not even be able to mourn. They will be struck completely numb by the righteous judgment of God.
As we conclude this explainer and reflect on the terrifying severity of sin and the unyielding zeal of God's providence to purify his people, we're left with a really sobering challenge regarding our own faith and obedience today. Think about it. In your own spiritual walk, are you harboring worldly dross, trusting in secular powers over the Creator, or are you prepared to be the one who stands in the gap? Let this incredible study of Ezekiel challenge us all to seek purity and to intercede faithfully for the world around us.